Very happy to see all of you, some new friends and some old friends. And we're very, very happy, the Bookman and the Russell Kirk Center, to welcome Grace Olmstead to talk about her new book, which is here, called Uprooted. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, but you can pre-order from Amazon. So if you like what you hear, we think you should run right out to do it. It's really an amazing book. Grace has written for a number of publications, including the Bookman a few years ago, and has focused a lot on the themes that are reflected in this book, and has also a remarkable and wonderful newsletter, Substack, whatever. I'm too old to know exactly what you call it, but it's really wonderful content that she's been circulating around. Today, we're going to speak a lot about this book, as well as some other sort of related questions, which I think comes up with the core issue of sort of the American character, combined with human natural nature, which is to lay down roots, to know what tradition is, to be attached to their place in a country that sometimes doesn't care about that too much. And so how those two things interact, especially in Grace's own life, in how she comes to where she is. So we're going to let Grace, I think, tell us a little bit about this book. If you have any comments or questions, you can put it in the chat box, which I tend to read out once the initial presentation, and then a couple of other questions that I might have to get us started. We'll go through anybody's questions that they put in the chat. And at the very, very end, I'll end a minute or two early for Cecilia to tell us something about the Russell Kirk Center. Great, Grace, if I can lead it off with you and just tell us sort of where does this book come from? What kept you going to go through it? And as you read it, what themes or topics should we be looking at and looking for as we read through it?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It is an honor to get to be with you all, to talk to you about this book. And I hope that if you read it, you will enjoy it and come away with some of the themes and ideas that mattered so much as I was putting it together. Uprooted is really a book about and inspired by gratitude. It's a book written for my forebears, in particular for my late great-grandfather, who we fondly called Grandpa Dad. He was in his 90s when I was a child, and some of my fondest childhood memories are of the times I spent with him, listening to his stories, helping shuck corn that he grew on his farm, or helping play his favorite old gospel hymns on the piano or on the violin at family gatherings. And he was in his 90s, but his mind was just incredibly sharp. And he loved to tell us stories about his wife, Iva, his memories of farming pre-tractor, of the silent movies he watched as a boy at the old Emmett, Idaho movie theater. Grandpa Dad lived and died in the same community where he was born. And so he spent all 90 plus years of his life caring for the same acreage on a mesa outside of town and going to the same church. And although I and most other young people in our time have been told to get out of small rural towns, I find it remarkable that Grandpa Dad chose to stay, to stick, and to bless his people and his place. In addition to the work he did volunteering in the local community, frequenting local businesses, teaching Sunday school, working with and for his neighbors, Grandpa Dad also always sought to bless his community with the crops he grew. I've often called Grandpa Dad's sweet corn crop his crop of first fruits, in accordance with Proverbs 3, which commands the reader to honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. Grandpa Dad grew sweet corn just to give it away. He planted it specifically to bless his neighbors, family members, and members of his local church. And after he had harvested it, he would bring it to my grandparents' house, and we would shuck and cook and freeze the corn all together. It was a crop he grew to nourish and bless us. So back when I was in college, I had picked up running as a way to get away from my desk and to just refresh my mind. And one October day in the fall of my junior year, I think, I was jogging along the path and I remember suddenly catching the smell of wood smoke on the air. And I remember freezing in my tracks because all of a sudden I remembered Grandpa Dad, but in some ways it feels more appropriate to say I felt Grandpa Dad because in that moment I could feel his presence as if he were standing next to me. And I remembered his old clean gingham work shirts, his laughter, his country voice, his callous worn hands, and his stooped back. And I felt as if I could hear him sing my name the way he used to. And it's a hard moment to explain even now because in the moment, it almost felt as if I had been visited by a ghost, a presence never seen but intensely felt. And I have often wondered whether Russell Kirk, the master of ghost stories, might have convinced me that I did indeed feel the presence of a ghost. But regardless, I did feel my Grandpa Dad's joy and his love in that moment. And as I thought about him that day, I realized that everything I am and have achieved is tied to his labor and rootedness, to his determination to bless future generations of his family and to stick in the soil of that small farm community. And I began to ask myself that day whether I might owe something to the past and to place because of Grandpa Dad's life and his first fruits. And so Uprooted came to be. It is the result of the years of study and interviews and reading that followed that autumn jog. The book has some personal notes as I consider the role nostalgia and homesickness can play in connecting us to the past and to place. I ask whether our world might be haunted by what Wendell Berry identifies as the absence of presences and the presence of absences in his book, Jayber Crow. The book both begins and ends in the town's graveyard with the question of what we owe to the past and of where we will be buried. But the book explores these concepts of indebtedness and rootedness within the soil of my great-grandpa's farm town. It looks to the past and considers Emmett's history, economy, and culture, and tries to trace some of the legacies of both blessing and brokenness in its past. Then the book turns to Emmett's present generation and considers the farmers and townspeople living there now, the larger cultural and political pressures urging them to either stick in place or to leave it behind. I think it's important to consider all of this because our society has such a long history of cultivating and promoting rootlessness. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Wallace Stegner once called the United States two populations, the boomers and the stickers, and argued that our country has since been populated, torn apart, and rebuilt repeatedly by these two groups in their various guises. But even while the stickers have played an absolutely vital part of our history, it often feels as if the boomers have always held our cultural megaphones. Stickers are those who settle down and invest. Boomers come to extract value from a place and then to leave it behind. But another way to understand this concept perhaps is to think of these two populations as consumers and stewards, those who deplete a place for their own gain, who participate in our larger throwaway culture, as Pope Francis has put it, or those who seek to be rooted, to cultivate fruitfulness in place for present and future generations. Wallace Stegner believed that in the West, the land that both he and I grew up in, deeply lived in places are exceptions rather than the rule. For one thing, he explained all Western places are new. For another, many of the people who established them came to pillage or to work for pillagers rather than to settle for life. This becomes obvious when you look at the boom and bust cycles in places like Idaho, where many aspects of the natural landscape, the state's beaver population, for instance, gemstones, timber, soil, water, silver and gold, just to name a few, have been severely decimated by boom and bust cycles throughout the decades and centuries. For as long as Idaho has been settled, it seems people have just come and gone as things have gotten hard, as land or community demand more love than we are able to give. And it seems at this point that the cycles of conquest and depletion have gone on for so long that they often seem normal and just accepted at this point. But Patrick Deneen argues in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, a favorite of mine, that liberalism itself is largely responsible for this sort of consumptive destruction, as well as for the individualism and rootlessness, which incentivized their spread, I think. Through liberalism, he writes in his book, gratitude to the past and obligations to the future are replaced by a nearly universal pursuit of immediate gratification. Culture, rather than imparting the wisdom and experience of the past, becomes synonymous with crudeness and distraction, all oriented toward promoting consumption, appetite, and detachment. In our culture, it seems that success is most often tracked by one's ability to leave a place behind. The American dream is, in essence, about economic and class transience, the ability to move from poverty to wealth, from lack to abundance. And American economists, politicians, celebrities, even teachers often laud mobility and progression instead of any sort of planted mentality. We tell promising young people, you'll go far. And our cultural touchstones from Disney movies to pop songs generally suggest that separation and departure are inherent to triumph. Our elites are usually the most transient boomers of us all. Wealth is no longer built through allegiance to a community or town, but rather achieved in isolation by individuals. We grow wealth most often through rootlessness rather than through loyalty. And when prosperity abandons a place, we abandon it, at least if we're able to. The wealthy and corporate success stories of our own world, I think, are generally jetting from coast to coast or country to country. Christopher Lasch wrote, though, that it's important for us to understand that modern man is fully unconscious of his debt to the past. Our elites find it difficult to imagine a community that reaches into both the past and the future and is constituted by an awareness of intergenerational obligation. But if there isn't a better definition of what it means to be a conservative, I think that might be what it is. Sadly, he wrote that most ambitious people understand that a migratory way of life is the price of getting ahead. Rootedness and its resulting forms of community stewardship, I believe, are indispensable to communal flourishing, especially in our rural communities, because in rural towns, literal forms of rootedness and health on an ecological level, such as the health of soil, plant, and animal, are most often undergirded by and made possible by rooted, mutually giving communities, by people and associations who care about permanence, about what Edmund Burke called the democracy of the dead and unborn that make up our past, present, and future in a place. In the Middle Ages, Robert Nisbet notes in his book, Quest for Community, a town was more than a simple place of residence and occupation. It was itself a close association, and its members were bound to live up to its articles and customs. The village and its guilds kept alive sacred obligations of mutual aid, religious faith, and political responsibility. But Nisbet argues that in our own society and time, capitalism has substituted quantity for quality, process for function, bigness for smallness, and transformed intense communities of purpose into the sprawling relationships of the marketplace. I think America's farm towns, by nature of their enforced rootedness, held on to the virtues of Nisbet's medieval village actually longer than most. But they've dwindled, if not disappeared, in more recent decades, especially probably since the 1980s farm crisis and Earl Butts' urging to farmers to get big or get out. Even during World War II and after, farmers were being told that international trade should take precedent over the cultivation of local markets and sales. Farming was no longer to be understood as a primarily regional enterprise meant to feed one's neighbors, but rather as a global and heavily political enterprise. We've created a political and economic system that judges most rural communities not by how well they serve their own inhabitants or by the culture and the people they keep in place, but by their profit and utility. When I was working on my Novak journalism fellowship back in the day, which was about the struggles of family farming and farm towns, I remember I had to sell a lot of people in DC on the idea by explaining why farms mattered for national security or global trade or the like. It was rare to find people who believed in the worth of rural America or its farmers for their own sake. At least that's how it often felt. Maria Kafalas is co-author of the book Hollowing Out the Middle about rural America's brain drain. And she told me she also ran into this problem while she was working on her book. She remembers her publisher asking her, "So what if rural America dies?" Places like New York City, I think, and a lot of major cities may be so iconic and important, they're viewed as intrinsically valuable, but many rural towns are considered interchangeable and expendable, valuable not for their own sake, but because they have resources that can be exported to other places by large cooperation, or not cooperations, corporations. Um, but many rural or small towns' worth or lack thereof is contingent on what other spaces think of them, take from them, or offer them. And this is something Wendell Berry and economist John Eichert have both referred to as the economic colonization of rural America. Rural people and cultures are exploited not to benefit rural people, but to increase the wealth of corporate investors, according to Eichert. He sees industrial agriculture as the primary means of rural America's colonization because it is extractive and emphasizes profit over long-term health. But as we built up fewer, larger, and more specialized farms and decreased both local markets and locally purchased inputs, you can see that many rural communities seem to have lost their purpose. Small farm towns are increasingly seen as middle of nowhere, so to speak, practically non-existent in the eyes of the larger world. But I hope that my book will help shine light on the degree to which we have undervalued those small connected farm villages. The bonds of life they cultivated in their lifetime were thick and nourishing, and the virtues they fostered mattered deeply for communal health. Small farmers built a culture in Emmett, a shared set of beliefs, values, goals, and practices that emphasized stewardship, neighborliness, volunteerism, and responsibility. The farmers that undergirded this community worked hard to build up job opportunities for the kids who grew up there and did their best to keep health in the soil. When a farm community is working, I think it will be neighborly and multi-generational. It'll be made up of farmers who are training the next generation, whether sons and daughters or completely unrelated young folks who just want to get a start on the land. A farming community is a membership, a village that preserves culture and tradition in place. It remembers the past and carries it forward into the future. It's a membership in which I think conservation can be linked to innovation, in which we preserve and protect even as we continue to create. Sir Albert Howard was a turn of the century botanist who studied sustainable agriculture in India, and he suggested that soil regenerates through this life cycle of death, decay, and regrowth. To cultivate health, he suggested we must be investing as much or more fertility in the earth as we take from it. If we instead deplete the ground's resources, future generations pay the price. My own ancestors were not rich when they first arrived in Idaho, along with some other relatives from Kansas who had what was called the Idaho fever. My great-great-great-grandpa Walter Sisler traveled to Idaho around the turn of the century, and he began developing a 40-acre farm from the sagebrush outside New Plymouth, which is just a few miles west of Emmett. The hardships of hauling feed, travel, clearing the land, and building wore on a lot of members of the family, and they became discouraged. Everyone moved back to the heartland, except for Walter and Leanna, my great-great-great-grandparents, who decided to stay. Staying in place was not easy, but they were proud of what they had built. And when the Great Depression rolled around, Walter and Leanna opened up their home and barn to families in need of shelter and offered hospitality to them. They didn't have a lot, but they had enough to share, to serve others in their community when they were called upon to do so. And I think that my grandpa dad thus learned the importance of rootedness and community service from his grandparents, just as I learned it from him. There was a chain of membership and belonging that they handed down, along with the virtues that kept that chain strong. Not everything, of course, planted in the soil during my great-grandparents' time was good. Farmers can and do abuse the land and its inhabitants at times, exploiting natural resources and people surrounding them. Many forms of industrialized agriculture in our day, I think, have continued this legacy, subjugating workers, animals, soil, and water to a desire for larger profit or ease. In the soil of Emmett, there are often still traces of arsenic and other chemicals that were once sprayed in old orchards in the soil, chemicals from past generations that continue to poison present ground. But there are farmers living in Emmett currently who are working in their lifetime to restore that depleted and broken soil and to sow health and wholeness and life there instead. So in my book, I asked the reader and myself whether we also ought to think of our lives as nourishing or depleting our own home soil, whether our rootedness can reap benefits for future generations, or whether our consumerism and transience might poison ground long after we're gone. I fear that as those of us who grew up in the soil of our small farm towns leave, we remove the life that should have remained, that would have resulted in hope and nourishment for the next generation. And this matters because the price of mobility on the part of America's upper classes and educated classes is generally paid by those who either do not have the money, the opportunity, or the desire to leave. People left behind in aging, empty rural towns often see few opportunities for their future. They lack both social and economic security. Those who stay in place or are stuck in place may forever fight the assumption that they weren't enough or are not enough to do something more with their lives. But I believe a farm community can and should nurture goodness in the lives of its inhabitants. I think Emmett specifically is testament to the love and work of many past and present community members. Like any and every place that has survived generations of hardship, it has a legacy that is beautiful, but also marred and troubled in various places. And it needs to be loved for its own sake. Our communities need to be loved not for anything they might do for far-flung stretches of the world, but for what they can do for their own community members. I believe this is the only way we can begin to fight off the exploitation and abuse that have often characterized our rural homelands. And it's the only way we can begin to build places that draw newcomers and keep the children of the land in place, by valuing places' local vocation, just as our medieval forebears did, and by keeping that local vocation paramount as our places serve other distant populations. Our lands, towns, and cities have always needed stickers and stewards, people who will stay and try to heal broken ground, who will try to restore what's been lost and seek to bless future generations. What I think is perhaps less acknowledged is the fact that we need to stick for our own sakes as well, that it is actually good for us to be rooted in healthy soil, and that our souls often crave this sort of deep embeddedness in a place and in a community. Simone Weil once wrote that to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations for the future. Pope Francis, in a speech he gave in Estonia in 2018, noted that there is no worse form of alienation than to feel uprooted, belonging to no one. A land will be fruitful and its people bear fruit and give birth to the future, only to the extent that it can foster a sense of belonging among its members, create bonds of integration between generations and different communities, and avoid all that make us insensitive to others and lead to further alienation. Wendell Berry has long argued that as embodied humans, we cannot view ourselves apart from place or community, but that even while obvious distinctions can be made between our body and other bodies and our body and the world, it is also true that all these things that, in his words, appear to be distinct are nevertheless caught in a network of mutual dependence and influence that is the substantiation of their unity, which is such a beautiful thought. Body, soul, community, and world are all susceptible to each other's influence and conductors of each other's influence. Our health is inseparable from the health of our places. But the work of bringing health back to these communities will be, as Wendell Berry has said, a difficult and uphill work that will probably require several generations. We need to reestablish complex local cultures, re-strengthen our sense of communal memory, and reanimate traditions of care. I think bringing back health may also require some soul searching on the part of both conservatives and progressives over the social, political, and economic atmosphere we've created in our country and how it does often make it difficult to live a rooted life. For instance, I think conservatives should grapple with Robert Nisbet's argument that capitalism is especially prone to fostering a vision of the autonomous, rootless individual. He wrote that capitalism's great impersonal system sees humans as individual units of energy and production rather than as members of a society or a place. And while that does mean that we've built a lot of wealth over the course of our history, it also means I think we've ignored deeper spiritual and communal needs and broken down the social capital that so often supports communal health. And progressives, for their part, must reckon with the fact that individualism and self actualization are not enough to foster happiness and well being on their own. The federal government is not enough on its own to meet the needs of its citizens. Humans crave membership within localities and associations. And rather than building a cultural or political environment that would foster this sort of belonging, liberalism has historically done the opposite. I think we could do a lot in rural America by not just investing in individuals, by, for instance, giving subsidies to individual farmers or nuclear farming families, but also by looking to nourish and support the groups and networks that support them. That could involve preserving and protecting farmland via agricultural easements, providing land links that help pass land down from one generation to the next, revitalizing struggling downtowns, and countless other measures that are all focused on connecting members of a local community and enabling them to help and support each other. I think reform could also happen by investing our capital in stewardship and long-term care rather than in temporary profit. For instance, an effort on the USDA or private actors to invest the majority of its funds in regenerative programs rather than in cash crop subsidies. Efforts like this would make a massive statement about our priorities as a country, whether we want to encourage short-term profit or long-term fidelity and health. It would also require people to stay in place and cultivate something for the long haul. Beyond these things, I also think we have a simple yet incredibly difficult work ahead of us. We need to reanimate people's love of place and of sticking. We need to make rootedness great again and convince more young people that it is, in fact, a good thing to live in a quiet provincial place and to love it well. This is in many ways the work Wendell Berry has done his entire life through his essays, novels, and poems. His example suggests to me that it is perhaps first and foremost a work of poetry and art, of drawing the souls of men and women toward homecoming by animating their imaginations and their loves. But I think our lived examples can also play a big part in this, as Grandpa Dad's story makes clear. If not for his example of devotion to place, I would not have written this book. And so I think each of us can, if we choose, serve as an inspiration to others to love place well and to live as stickers. In my mind, returning home or speaking of the importance of rootedness shouldn't be about nostalgia or sentimentalizing place. There is a place for nostalgia and it can be a good instinct. But I think in some ways it can also form as a distraction from the actual real love that we should be forming. One thing I know in my book is that loving a place well means loving it for what it is, with all its brokenness and all its vices, and seeking to address and reform those things rather than to ignore them. Anything less is idolization, not love. And I fear that that would just create a blindness amongst homecomers that would prevent them from truly knowing, serving, or loving their landscapes well. As for me in my own life, I don't know yet when or whether I'll return to Idaho. I hope to someday if job and life circumstances allow. But I'm also committed to living like my great grandpa as well as I'm able as a transplant, and to hopefully display the same stewardship and love in Virginia for as long as I'm here. And I hope that's a helpful message to all those people who perhaps cannot return home or don't have a home to return to. Not all of us are called to homecoming, but I think all of us can try to live a more rooted life.
Thank you, because that was wonderful. And I do want to catch up on a couple of things that you had said, which, as an example, going back home, at what point in time, people like the writer Kevin Williamson wrote a relatively famous article that basically assumed, and you tell me if you agree, the free market model, and said that's what happens. And if it hit your town, you should just get up and leave. Not that the market is a human designed system for certain purposes, certain common goods that one would ideally want to have. It just sort of happens and it destroys your town and you just leave. And then someone like Bill Kaufman, whom I don't know if you've heard of, is one of my favorites. He spent a large part of his life out of his hometown that he grew up in upstate New York, and you decide, no, I'm going back, and I'm going to, because what is in that town is just as rich and has just as many moving and important stories that maybe I can write about, or I can relive again, or explain to my children and build on another generation. So I don't care what the free market model is supposed to tell me, I'm going back. And so you have one on each side of that side of the story. And your question about what would the governmental institutions teach reminded me of, there's an island that I go to sometimes in the summer off the coast of Maine. And at one point they had a high school principal come in that basically said, you all need to leave this island, high school graduates. You should go find another job somewhere. And their families were like, we're lobster people, and we shouldn't be paying you to teach them to leave us. I mean, if people have to, of course, as you say, as a friend of mine explained to me once, there is something sometimes called a vocation. If you feel like you need to be a medical doctor of a certain kind that only can be done in certain cities or whatever, and that's what you feel your either your skills or your divine gifts have been given, whatever it is, you have to go. That's one thing. He said, but just to give them a lesson that you don't belong here because look at this place, it's too small or whatever. That's a lesson that someone can change and say, no, we're going to teach you how to survive and how to maintain this community. And I did read in your book, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about this, that there is a governmental driver in addition to the corporate market, because I think they work together in this way to say that we want you away from your community, and part of the reason is we then can have more control of you. We could turn you into a consumer, and to the point that you were making before, sure, you can join some sort of community in your big town that's maybe political and maybe only has to agree with you on everything. You can't go to a place that's less virtuous than you think it is, or has to be loved with its good and its bad. Instead, you just stay with us where we all agree on the same thing. And do you think that those obstacles are, when you say it might take some time to do this sort of stuff, are those the kinds of messages that conservatives or progressives who feel are in our way about small communities and what communities should be, that those are things that still have to be surmounted?
Absolutely. It's interesting because Sarah Smarsh is a rural writer from Kansas who has written a memoir called Heartland, and has written a lot about her own experiences as someone who grew up on a farm in Kansas and has stayed in Kansas as a native of that place. But one thing she argues is that we all too often define the value of living in a place only by economic profit. And so, of course, by that measure, perhaps it is best to leave a small town behind if you're not going to be able to proceed up the ladder to greater economic success, or perhaps even within whatever realm of your profession you're in, if you're not able to gather greater prestige as you work on your writing career, for instance.
Right.
That could also be an argument to leave. But she said, what are we measuring wealth and value by? And are we able to include in it the ability to look up at the night sky and to see the stars, the ability to live in close proximity to one's family, the ability to live in the land and to love it well? There's all these other forms of value that just aren't getting taken into account. And perhaps they aren't taken into account because you can't measure them very well, generally. And our society likes to put its greatest value on the things it can measure, on quantitative rather than qualitative measures. I think that in terms of the way that our government oftentimes has impacted these communities, one thing I talk about a lot in my book is the way that the Farm Bill and the US Department of Agriculture really tried to get more people off of the land in the early 20th century up until the 1970s and 80s and beyond. There was a message that there were too many people farming, and they wanted to consolidate land into the hand of fewer people, which did in many instances decimate the health of farm villages and farm communities, and made it so that instead of being able to rely on each other for support, farmers increasingly had to look to the state and to the federal government in order to give them the emergency help that they need, whether it's through crop insurance, through subsidies, through getting their crops to market because they were no longer being grown for local industries that would, be then selling them to local consumers. Everything was then at a scale and of a model that left out the village and instead went straight from individual farmers to the state. And I think it's interesting how Nisbet kind of foresaw a lot of this and wrote about it in his book, Quest for Community, how that breakdown of the intermediary institutions, the associations, then results in a situation where individuals are completely reliant upon the state for all of their goods that they need in order to have a flourishing life. But it is a broken form of flourishing. It doesn't have the community solidarity, the support, the beauty of a village that they used to have. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And not only should you depend on me, the government, is that does separate you out from all of your natural connections that aren't the government. And I do think that that's a very, maybe at the time it was well intentioned or whatever, but at the end of the day, it results in a lot of people having little to rely on at the farm level. And then the people that they said, no, you shouldn't be farmers anymore, are now scattered everywhere else where they may not have been. And shouldn't the government policy at least take that into account and not just say we're an international farming community that we have to feed the world? And to do that, we have to get rid of our citizens from where they want to be. That analysis in a lot of your book struck very deeply to me, even though I am not a person from the Midwest. I grew up in Brooklyn, which although no one believes this, but in the 1970s and 80s was a lot of very tiny communities who stuck together, were there forever. And there was something in that 70s, 80s, 90s, there was some movement of making things more expensive. New York City was doing various things to become an even bigger attraction to finance capital. And people started to leave because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. And we're breaking up those communities that had been there for a long time. And one reason why, and you say a little bit of this in the book, people sometimes choose careers or jobs, even if it's a place that's not so attractive to them, is so they could stay near their families. I could be, when I was 26, I wanted to be a professor of classics, but that wasn't going to keep me in New York, which is what I wanted to be. So I had to try and do something else. And New York City happens to be, for better or worse, that city that absorbs a lot of opportunities, mostly for the worse, but for what I was here for, my families had been here, so it turned out to be okay, at least for me. And so the other question that I was thinking of asking is, and you would mention this in your talk, is that, so do you think that wanting to maintain those community habits, no matter where you might be, is that, do you think, specifically a result of your experience, or is that something that you think, if you scraped each person a little bit and talked to them about it, that's basically what most people want, even if they know they can't go back home? Most of them don't really want to come to a big city and move around forever. And not have any, but they're being told that's what they should do, because, for your point, because of the quantitative measures we count. Or so do you think it really depends on where they had grown up, or does it matter? That's just what people care about, and that's what they need to be encouraged to do.
It's such an interesting question. I think that the family you come from, the place you live in, can probably make that inner voice stronger or weaker. I do think that Vey is right, that it is probably an inner longing just of the human soul to be rooted. If you have perhaps lived in a situation where you have been constantly moving about, I'm curious whether that would make it much difficult to listen to or to hear that longing and to express it, because what examples are you going to even draw upon in order to make it real,
Right.
if you don't have that in your lived experience? And I think that for a lot of people, if they have lived in a case where they have examples to draw on, relatives in which they saw rootedness happen and saw that it was actually an enjoyable life for them, then it makes it feel more possible.
Yeah.
I think the average American moves somewhere in the realm of 11 to 20 times in their lifetime. And so we just have had a tendency as a culture to just move about quite a bit.
Right.
Whereas a lot of our counterparts historically didn't have those same inclinations, whether because they owned land and it was kept in place for longer as part of their inheritance, or
Hmm.
because I think it's Tocqueville actually who says that Americans, in part because we don't have the same aristocratic nature as our European forebears, we're just much more used to moving about and seeking greater wealth, and we are very discontent with our fortunes. And that's not always been a bad thing, but I think when you look at the actual health of our towns and also our ecology, our landscapes, you can see the toll that that has taken.
Right. And I think that all of that is true. And I would put the general, although not always, disposition of Americans to come and move around and look for more money to be different than some of what you describe in this book, which is this is the government agency telling you you have to do this. This is what the corporate organizations are telling you a consumer should be and why you shouldn't live around there or stay at home. Those two, I think, one is building on the desire for the first, but tends to have more of a detrimental effect because they're together. I think that's exactly right. Um, and let me ask, I have a question has come in is how do you think or hope or expect that people who live in Emmett will respond to this book if they know it's coming, have seen it, or you've talked to them about it? Uh, was it a challenge at all writing about not your maybe not your great grandfather or grandfather, but other people in town? And do you think what do you think their reaction might be?
I hope that it will be positive. I tried to do a very careful job of writing respectfully of every person that I wrote about and of taking their experience into account, of using their own words, and of talking to people multiple times so that I wasn't just, showing up once, getting the story, and then leaving, but I was, as much as I was able to, keeping in touch, cultivating a relationship, and having a long view of their life and what they're going through.
Hmm.
And so I'm sure that they will disagree with me on some things. That's inevitable. And I'm sure that any time that I am critical, there will perhaps be some defensiveness. That's also understandable. But I, to the utmost of my ability, tried to write a picture that was loving, compassionate, and that took into account the experiences of people as a whole, rather than just getting a snapshot of a moment in time that sought to fit whatever my
Right.
overarching point was going to be. And so I really do hope that shines through. And I've also been able to share the entirety of the book with several of my family members and have been really blessed to get their feedback and
Right.
thoughts. And so that's been wonderful as well. And my grandpa Wally is responsible for a lot of the historical family anecdotes. And so I'm really grateful to him for sharing all of that time with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's great. That's great. Uh, and someone else has written in saying that they're watching or living in Vermont, which has gone through some consolidation of school districts because I guess the population is getting small, and there was a lot of concern how to move to a larger scale organization, causing a loss of community identity, which within those places that are now being absorbed. Uh, can you tell us what either Emmett or the statewide school organization looks like? Are things consolidating into bigger places? Kids don't have to travel further, whatever the example might be. And do those communities still have their own specific community schools, or just things getting bigger to accommodate the fewer kids to get them all to one spot?
Yeah. I know Emmett still has a couple of high schools, middle school. Um, One interesting thing that's happening that I cover later on in my book is that this area is actually suburbanizing because
Oh,
Boise is one of those mid
yeah.
cities that is incredibly popular to move to right now. So there's kind of a mixed blessing there in the sense that it's gaining some people, but farmland itself is being paved over at an astronomical rate. I think the statistics say that somewhere of upwards of 60% of its farmland could be gone
Oh,
in the
yeah.
next several decades. And so that's a problem that we need to grapple with in terms of thinking about the land that we've been given to steward and how to steward it well, how to build well, so that even as we welcome new people in, we're not losing the land that we've been given. But in terms of the school districts, I know that they've struggled to get bonds passed to make improvements on the local school. One of my favorite experiences, which didn't actually make it into the book mainly because of space, was a local farmer on the bench telling me about the one-room schoolhouses and how, back in the day, he remembers how they would walk to school. And it was much more of a village atmosphere in which not just the town itself, but breaking it down into these very minute regions. These families were interconnected by their one-room schoolhouses, and where they were, on the bench, the mesa outside of town, or in the town of Pearl, which is nearby, or Ola, or these various places, and how they each had their own character because of that small, very dense school system. So I know that some of that has been lost for sure.
Right. Yeah, your passage about the paving over the land as it got closer to Emmett was heartbreaking, at least to me, in reading it. Okay, so a couple of so another question. So, um, if you can provide any more detail about the tension between a desire for localism and maybe some level of capitalism or liberalism, liberal capitalism or not, are they necessarily always opposed? Or is the question is, can we maintain the good of what capitalism can do, which is and has made people who are poor or were poor uh, more able to live, um, or while doing that at the same time while fostering a love for place and community, or they have to be one or the other?
It's a very difficult question. I
Yeah,
would just be honest and say I don't feel entirely qualified to answer.
yeah,
I have really appreciated the work of people over at the Open Markets Institute to look at what it would be like to kind of look at our situation in terms of the monopolies that have been built around agriculture, many of which are fed by crony capitalism. It's a situation in which the government in many ways enables the growth of these
right.
large monopolies, and they feed off of each other in various ways. And that's been something that we could be fighting better. And if that were to happen, we might actually have a more open and more free market in which smaller players and local industry clusters would be allowed to hopefully rise back up to the surface. And I think that would be very interesting to explore in greater depth. I was recently talking to someone who grew up in Pennsylvania on a farm, who told me she thought that my next book I should write should be about how actually capitalism and the health of small family farms are incompatible. But that was her opinion. And so I'll have to do a lot more research before I'm able to come to any sort of final decision on that
Right.
one.
I'm and just thinking about it in light of this question, I don't think they're necessarily incompatible, but you have to prioritize the goods that you want. And
Yeah.
if people want to, live a liberal capitalistic life, move to New York, move to San Francisco, move to Chicago, but don't impose it on everybody else. Let those communities live out the way they want. It's a big country. I mean, what I drew from your book was that this a lot of these, I shouldn't say a lot, but a certain amount of driving factors were basically policies and perspectives that these people wanted imposed over the whole country. and they weren't accepting that your comment about people should leave the farm, about who cares about the farms or whatever. That's just a perspective. If they don't, they should leave. They shouldn't then say, no, we're going to have fewer farm owners. That's all going to be our policy. So I think that there may be some ability to accommodate, but unclear. And so I'm going to ask you a question before we leave, since we are the Russell Kirk Center. You do have a comment about Russell in an interview you'd given, I think, for the Gospel Coalition, and you had nice things about him. So as we end, I'd like to hear how you found him and what you thought about his writing or whatever else you can remember.
Well, I first read Russell Kirk's work in college, and it just immediately resonated with me on a gut level, as I think oftentimes certain works can when you meet a kindred spirit through the printed word. And one of my favorite quotes from Russell Kirk is that he says he found himself a conservative once I began to reflect on such concerns. And I can relate to that very deeply. I think because of my upbringing and because of people like Grandpa and Dad, many of these things were imparted to me by, I think Wendell Berry says at one point, by osmosis, that there's these cultural traditions that we take in oftentimes on a spiritual or a subconscious level before they even become fully clear in our heads. But then as I began to read Russell Kirk and he began to express those thoughts verbally or on the page, I began to see how much they had informed my character and my view of the world. So the affection for permanent things, the importance of order, the virtues of modesty and prudence, and the importance of particularity and distributism. There's so much that he's written in his various essays and written works that has continued to form what I think about the world. And I think just continues to be vitally important to restoring and reforming conservatism today. And I think that it would be wonderful if I could just go ahead and spend another book talking about the work of Russell Kirk. And I wish I had quoted him more in this one, but I'm very thankful for the work you guys are doing as well, just making sure that more people are reading him and understanding the importance of his philosophy.
Well, thank you. And it's funny you should say that, because although we come from different backgrounds, as a city kid, I read Russell's work and it hit me like exactly who I wanted to read, because what he was saying was part of my lived experience, but no one was talking about it in New York City. And I first learned of him in college and did the same thing and read about it and say, boy, that this makes sense to me. And so I continued to read and got to hear him speak a couple of times, which was really great. So I want to make sure we have enough time. Cecilia, did you want to say something towards the end?
Yes. Thanks, Gracie, for covering so many different topics. And I know you have, I'm sure, a lot more too in your book that I'm going to get a chance to talk to yet. But I just wanted to say a couple of things for those of you who are new to the Kirk Center. The center continues the work, as Gracie said, of Russell Kirk, author of The Conservative Mind, Roots for American Order, Eliot and His Age, and so many other books, to essentially to transmit an inherited body of learning, and to then in that way to aid in cultural renewal. And I just want to let you know that if you don't receive our newsletter, we have a regular print newsletter, which is just twice a year. Actually, it's called Permanent Things, and it is and you can just sign up for that either on the website, kirkcenter.org, or you can just send me an email at info@kirkcenter.org, and just with your mailing address, and we'll get that out to you. I do want to pick up on one thing that Gracie mentioned about, was that the Kirk Center is based at the home and library of Russell Kirk in Mecosta, Michigan, which, if any of you have been there, is my dad saw very much as a romantic ghost town, because there's a lot of empty stores and various abandoned family farms around it that make it look somehow romantic in his eyes. But it was his ancestral village, and that's why he ended up, settling there full time, even though he traveled for speaking engagements and things like that. But something else you said kind of struck me too, because my kids actually call it the middle of nowhere. So that's literally what they call it. It's actually based essentially in the center of Michigan. So it kind of, affectionately call it that. So I can understand a lot of the connections that people think of with these, with the various places in kind of the rural area and kind of the a lot of the towns that when my dad settled there, a lot of people were lumbermen, and that's what came in that boom and bust cycle. And they came in as lumbermen, forest the trees, and then my dad said he was always atoning for the sins of his ancestors by planting tons and tons of trees in that area. He was fortunate in that time when he was young that he used to take the train up through there. Unfortunately, there's no longer passenger rail. And I think that was a big contributing factor to the fact that, there's not really a lot of, what should we say? There's not a lot of traffic through there in a good way, that you sometimes need some traffic through there. But there is a lovely bookstore. There is a used bookstore. If for those of you who've been there, there is a used bookstore. I'm happy to say my brother-in-law, Marcos Flores, and my sister Felicia have just bought the old, what used to be called the Snow Queen in our town, which is the old ice store.
Oh, that's great.
This spring, it will reopen as Coffee and Cream. And it's going to be, a small, well, mostly ice cream, some small coffee shop and things like that. And so we're hoping to bring some people back in through Mecosta again. But it is, so when you come to Mecosta and you come to the Kirk Center, it is based at the actual, home and library of my parents. My mother is, of course, still there in Mecosta. And it keeps that sense of rootedness. And I think that was part for my dad, that obviously was a very important part to him, but both in terms of the intellectual history of idea, our cultural inheritance that way, as well as the actual, the physicality, the locality of it in that. So they went a little longer than I expected, but there are so many different themes in there I just wanted to pull out as well. Thanks, Gracie.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again very much, Gracie, for coming here and talking to us about your book. I'll put it up again. Everyone who's listening, you should rush right out and get that book, which is out in a couple of weeks. Thank you again for spending the time with us talking about this book and the important themes that you put in here.
Oh, thank you so much, all of you, for coming and listening. And thank you so much, Gerald and Cecilia, for the work you do and for including me tonight.
Great. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.